cartoons on TV, like from several decades ago, you might see at the bottom it says color by Technicolor. And you see that on a lot of old movies too, and you might have wondered what that means. And Technicolor was a process for adding color to motion pictures. The first motion pictures, movies, back in the early part of the 1900s were all in black and white. And then they started trying to figure out how to add color to that. And they tried a few different processes, and they settled on Technicolor because it was the one that worked the best. So The Wizard of Oz was one of the first big major movies that was done with Technicolor in 1939. And when people went to see this movie, they were just amazed at the color because they hadn't seen this before. Movies were new, so it was already kind of like this crazy, wonderful thing to see a screen with things moving around. And now it was in color. It looked like real life, and it was brilliant, wonderful color. You can see the green on the witch there. And then there's Dorothy's Ruby Slippers. And this is interesting because The Wizard of Oz, it was a book first before it was a movie. And in the book, the slippers weren't ruby colored, they were silver. But when they made the movie, they changed them to ruby because having this wonderful Technicolor that they could make these brilliant colors on the screen, adding the color to the slippers, it had the power to transform the experience, to make the movie even better. And it was like a really incredible thing. They still do that in movies. Color can transform the experience. This is from The Sixth Sense, if you've seen that. The color red happened a lot in the movie, and it signified death and different things. If you watch the movie, you might not get that. You might not even notice that the color red means something. But when you get to the end, it kind of all makes sense, and you're like, oh, I get it. It kind of just pulls everything together. So it's just another way of transforming an experience. TV, too, started out in black and white. It was only in the 60s and 70s when color TVs came around, and still not everybody had them at home. So you'd see this, you'd see motels with a sign that said color TV because that was a pretty big deal. Even in the 80s, a lot of people didn't have color TV. I grew up with a black and white TV, so my Smurfs weren't blue, they were gray. My Big Bird was gray too. It didn't detract from the story though, because the thing, when you're watching TV or movie, there's things moving around, there's things happening, and that's what the thing is. It's what's happening. It's not the color, really. That's not a big part of the story. Today on TV, the colors are brilliant and things look like they're real. It's kind of amazing. Computers, too, they didn't start out in black and white. They started out with one color. Those of us who are older, the first computers we used just had green text like this on a screen. They didn't have color yet. And then when the web came around, we didn't have the millions of colors available we had today. A lot of the monitors then could only display a few hundred colors. So what we had to do is use these web-safe colors. There were only certain colors you could use on your website to make sure that they'd be able to be displayed on every monitor. If you use colors outside of these few hundred colors, you might not get the results you expected. So it was really limiting. Now, of course, monitors and devices can display millions of colors. Even more than the eye can see. But there's a difference between what we see on a website on a computer than what we see in those movies and TV shows. And the difference is that the color isn't an important thing in movies and TV. The story is important. But when you're looking at a screen, at a computer or website, there's not things that are moving around. We're looking at a website on a screen. We're thinking it's like a picture. We feel like websites are pictures. We've always thought that. And so we try to make websites that look like they're pictures. We want them to look exactly like they look in our head. We pick colors in Photoshop and try to control exactly what's on the screen. I know. Thank you. This is something that speakers sometimes do. They make a blank screen because we're saying something important and you're supposed to actually listen instead of look at the screen. So that's not a mistake. But thank you for letting me know. So when we're looking at websites, it's not about the website. That's not the only thing. We're dependent on this physical medium, the screen that we use to convey the colors. And it's not always the same, so we need to think about that. But first, we're going to understand how the color gets on the screen, what makes a color what it is. And there's three qualities that work together: hue, value, and saturation. Hue is what we think of when we think of color. It's like red or blue or green or purple. It's pretty straightforward. Value, then, is the lightness or darkness of a hue, how much white or black is added to it. So here you see purple in the middle, which is a pure purple, and then to the left we have lighter values of that hue, and to the right darker values of the hue. Value is the most important of those three qualities because it determines how we recognize what we see in front of us. If we remove the hue from this and just leave the value, we can still see this. It's a black and white picture. We can still see that there's people and trees and things happening. So you can have value without hue, but you can't have hue without value. If you had colors that were all the same value, you wouldn't actually be able to see things and recognize things like you do in a picture. Saturation is the third quality. It's the intensity of a hue. At the top, you see a fully saturated color, and then going down, we add gray for a dull or muted color, which is unsaturated. So gray is fully unsaturated, and pure colors are fully saturated. So the way this turns out, this is a photo of something with nice bright colors that's fully saturated. By adding gray, we make it less colorful, less saturated. And sometimes it's easy to confuse saturation value. Saturation is just adding the gray, while value is adding black or adding white to make it darker or lighter. So color notation in CSS, this is straightforward. This is one of the first things we learn when we do CSS. But I'm going to kind of explain how it works and go over the basics just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So when we look at a color on the screen, it's light coming to our eyes. And there's three colors of light coming in, red, green, and blue. And they combine to create the color that we see. So here, the green and red light colors combine and they create yellow. Blue and red colors combine to create magenta. And if you combine all three colors, you get white. What actually comes out of the screen is just that, red, green, and blue light. For each pixel you see on a screen, there's actually 3 subpixels, which are red, green, and blue. And each of those 3 subpixels are lit to a different intensity depending on the color we want that pixel to be. There's 256 possible values for each subpixel on the screen, which adds up to more than 16 million unique combinations. RGB notation is one of the 2 ways that we can do color on the screen. And all we're doing is specifying the intensity of each of those 3 subpixels very directly. So there's 256 possible values, goes from 0 to 255. You can either do it doing integers. So here you have 200 on the red, so you have a lot of red, 0 green, and a little bit of blue combined to create a color. Separate them with commas. Do the same thing with percentages. Pretty straightforward. Hex, the way we usually learn it first and usually do it, it's the same thing. There's 256 possible values, but it goes from 00 to FF using a base 16 set of numbers. And it's the same thing, just 2 sets of digits specifying the red, green, and blue. We usually do this because it's just easier to type without all the commas and parentheses and everything. The problem with any of these RGB notations is it's not easy to understand what the colors are. Like if I wanted to make yellow, how do I combine red, green, and blue to create yellow? That's not intuitive at all. If you work with colors a long time, you might get to know it, but you probably won't. I have no idea what numbers to use. I have to look it up in Photoshop or something. So this is an easy way to do colors. But luckily, there's another way to do colors that's a lot easier. And not everybody's familiar with this, HSL notation. It's newer to CSS. It's supported in most browsers. It's not supported in IE8 or older. So if you're using this notation, you need to do a fallback color. You can do that easily using SAS, so you don't have to do it manually for each one. HSL stands for hue, saturation, lightness. So these are different qualities of colors that we're going to change numbers on to get the color that we see on the screen. The first number is hue, which is an integer. Here we're using 120, which is green. All the colors just go on a color wheel like this. Starting with red at 0, green is 120, blue is 240. So you just pick the color you want, and then you're going to vary the saturation and lightness. So we have green, 100% is full saturation, which means we didn't add gray to it. 50% on the end is the normal value for lightness. So a higher number would be more lightness, so lighter color. A lower number would be less lightness. So this is the number we're starting with. It's pure green, 100% saturation, and normal lightness. If we change a second number to 50%, we make the color more gray. It's less saturated. If we change the third number to a lower number, we decrease the lightness, or we can increase the lightness. So using HSL notation, it's a lot more intuitive than RGB. If I wanted to create a yellow, I'd just pick yellow off the color wheel and then adjust the saturation and lightness to get whatever color I wanted. It's pretty simple. If you're putting something together in the browser, it's usually easier to use HSL because you can do the colors in your head. If you're using Photoshop, you can't easily convert those colors to HSL, so you're probably still going to want to use the RGB notation. We can also use color notation for opacity, which is how transparent something is on the screen. All this does is it adds an extra channel. The A stands for alpha, which is a measure of opacity. So RGBA is the same as using RGB except we're adding a fourth number. It goes from 0 for fully transparent to 1 to fully opaque. Colors are fully opaque by default, which means you can't see anything through them. So you can do this using RGB, either the integers or the percentages, but you can't add opacity to hex numbers. So this is what opacity looks like. We have here 5 blue boxes. The one on the top, the opacity is 1, so it's fully opaque. The one on the bottom, the blue box, you can't see. The opacity is 0, so it's fully transparent or invisible. And then between that, different levels of opacity. The CSS, what it does, it takes the two colors, the blue of the box and the red of the text, and combines them together to get the new color. You can also use the opacity property in CSS to make things transparent, but it works differently. If you're applying opacity to something like a div, it's going to make everything in the div transparent. That means the background, the borders, the text is all going to be transparent. Whereas if you use color transparency, you can make only the text transparent or only the background transparent. So it's a lot more precise. You can also use HSL notation. It's the same thing. You take your HSL notation and add that fourth number at the end like this. So that's how color notation works in CSS. Again, I know my slide is blank. You don't need to tell me. But the important thing to users is how the color looks on the screen. When you're picking your colors for a website, something you need to know is not everybody sees the same color. And we forget this a lot when we're making websites because we're just like, I want exactly this color and it goes with this color and we want everything perfect. But that's not how the web works, unfortunately. The first issue is color blindness. 1 in 20 people are colorblind. It's more common in men. How many people here are colorblind? Anybody? There's a few. A lot of people won't admit to it, probably. Color blindness can more accurately be called color deficiency. It's not being blind to color. Colorblind people don't really see in black and white. They just only see some colors and not other colors. This is an example of what a colorblind person might see. The top left is what a normal rainbow color looks like, and each of the other 3 are variations on different types of color blindness that people have. The most common color blindness is green-red, where those 2 colors, green and red, tend to look the same. So this is what normal looks like. If you're in a fruit market, you look at this, you can see red and green on all the fruit, looks like they're different colors. If you're red and green colorblind, you see this. And I look at this, I'm like, how does anybody pick out fruit? If they're colorblind, they all look exactly the same. It's kind of crazy. And if you're not colorblind, it's hard to adjust the fact that a lot of people experience the world this way, and they've always experienced the world this way. So when you're making websites, you need to think about this. You can't just use colors to mean things because not everybody's going to see those colors. Another issue to bring up, there's grayscale browsers, like older Kindles and things like that, some older phones. People might be going to your website not seeing the color at all. When you're using color to have meaning, you also need to have a backup, for accessibility for colorblind people. You're not just going to rely on color. For example, a stop sign is red. Everybody sees red and they know to stop, but it's also octagon shape. No other signs have 8 sides like that. So if you're colorblind, you see that octagon shape and it hits in your head immediately. That's a stop sign. You don't even need to read it and think about it. So we have 2 things going on here. So even if you can't see the color, you still know what's happening with the sign. Another thing to think about on websites is where the color is the content. You have to let people know what you're talking about. For example, this site here, we're selling shirts. They're in a bunch of different colors. If you hover over one of the colors here, it shows the shirt in that color and then tells you what the color is. But the problem is, it says it's Persian jewel. I mean, if you're colorblind, you're going to this site, you're like, what is Persian jewel? What does that mean? Why can't they just call it light blue? If you're a colorblind person, you might not know what colors look like, but along the line, somewhere, someone has told you, hey, you look good in blue, you should buy blue shirts. So you buy blue shirts. And you go to this website and you see that the shirts are in Persian jewel, so you don't buy any shirts from this website and you go somewhere else. There's a lot of websites you can go to that will show you how your site looks to colorblind people, but the easiest way to test is just turn off color in your browser or on your computer entirely. And then try navigating your website, going out to all the different things and seeing if anything happens. If you go to a page and you're like, wait a second, I can't do this because it says click the green button and I can't see which one's green. If you have a Mac, there's in accessibility settings, there's an option to just use grayscale. It's pretty straightforward. If you're using Windows, it's not built in the system. You actually have to download some applications that will do this for you. But this is something really important to test on your websites to make sure they're going to work for everybody. So apart from color blindness, that's just a few people. Forgetting them, what about the rest of us? Do we all see the same color? Unfortunately, the answer is no. There's all these colors in the world, and there's kind of this cultural construct you might have heard that, women see more colors than men. Like, women will see 10 shades of beige and men only see beige. And we hear that all the time, and it's funny, and we laugh at it. But the thing is, it's a little bit true, because men and women actually do see colors differently. They've done scientific studies of this and found men are less adept at distinguishing the shades in the middle of the color spectrum, like blues, greens, and yellows. So if they're shades that are really close together, men might have more trouble telling them apart than women do. The scientific reason for this, there's androgens like testosterone that alter the development in your visual cortex. And I don't know exactly what that means, but you can go read this study if you're actually curious. Warmer colors like orange are going to seem redder to men, and greens seem more yellow to men. So, that's really kind of interesting. This is only something they've studied in the last few years, but it's kind of amazing to think that we really don't all see the same colors. Our language actually also affects our perception of color. If you grew up in a culture where you have a box of 64 crayons and there's red and rust and brick and similar colors with different names, you're actually going to be better at distinguishing those colors than if you grew up in a type of culture where you don't have named colors like in a crayon box. They studied one African language in which the colors red and orange are actually the same word. There's not separate words for red and orange, whereas there's several different words for different shades of green. Because the way that they experience life, there's a lot more things going on with green they need to distinguish than with reds. So pretty much for Western cultures, we all experience colors the same. We know there's a lot of different colors. We grew up talking about colors. But if you're looking at some different cultures, that's also something to think about. Obviously the words are different in different languages, but just the way they look at the rainbow colors is going to be different. Okay, then there's what you think you see when you look at a color. So we've all seen this image, right? It's a dress it's black and blue. But if you're looking at it, you might see white and gold, and it's because the picture of the dress is overexposed and has poor light balance. Some people look at it and can see what the colors are supposed to be, and others look at it and see what the colors have been exposed into. And this was a big fight because we all see different things. And it's another thing when you're looking at websites. If you're putting colors on there that need to mean something, people aren't going to see necessarily what you are thinking that they're going to see. Okay, then there's screens, there's devices. Do colors look the same on every screen? Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. If you go into a store that sells TVs, this is kind of a really obvious example. You'll see a row of TVs on the wall, and they'll all be playing the exact same show, but they'll all look slightly different in their colors because different manufacturers have colors that look different. It's the same thing for computer monitors or mobile devices, is the manufacturer's colors are slightly different, or the models or the units, or even on an individual device, color can change over years as you're using it, or even as it's warming up over one day. So you're not going to see the exact same colors on every device. So the reason for this, RGB isn't actually color. Remember I talked about the 3 subpixels and how we're saying what the intensity of each of them is? It turns out that that's not a straightforward thing. RGB is like a recipe that each device can interpret however they want. And obviously they all interpret it very similarly, but not quite exactly the same. So that's something to keep in mind. This is an example. I took the same photograph, I put it on my MacBook and my iPhone, had full brightness, and held them next to each other, and this is what they look like. And if you can see, there's actually a pretty big difference between them. If you look especially at the blue, it's a dark blue on one and a light blue on the other. Exact same picture on 2 devices from the same manufacturer. And I was actually very surprised when I looked at this to find out how different they were. So all these colors you're carefully picking out to put on your website aren't what people are seeing. Even the angle of your laptop. If you're sitting with your laptop in your lap and you move the screen back and forth, it changes the contrast and the color slightly, so you'll see something different. A good place to start, make sure the calibration on your screen is right. So at least you're starting from a good place when you're looking at the colors on your site. But then keep in mind that's not what everybody's going to see. They might see something slightly different. So, and then here's the last problem we have, and that's light. The ambient light level in the room, as well as the brightness of the screen, is also going to affect how colors look. If you're sitting in your office designing a website, fluorescent lights all around you, you're going to see something different as opposed to if you were out in natural light somewhere. If you're in a dark room with your iPhone or your device and it has auto brightness, the screen is going to dim and that changes the color. If you're out in bright sunlight, everything on the screen is going to look washed out. So you're going to see very different things depending on where you are in the light around you. In CSS4, we have the light level media query, and it's unfortunately not available yet, but this is going to be really cool when it's available. Most devices, like mobile devices, have ambient light sensors, and they can tell the light that's around you. So you're going to be able to do media queries and see, is the room light or is the room dark or normal? And you can change the colors of your website with a media query depending on that lightness in the room. You can do this currently in JavaScript, but it only works in Firefox, but it's something that you can try out if you want. So what you want to do then is make sites, if you're looking at them in bright light, that's especially going to be the problem because there's not going to be enough contrast. If you're out in the sunlight with your phone, it's really hard to see things on the screen. But there's things we can do on a website to make it easier to see in that bright light. So remember that your job isn't to make colors look the same on every device. It's to make them look good and to have good usability on every device. So that's kind of the idea of responsive color. Responsive design is not just changing layouts, but also thinking about how people are using your device in different contexts. So it's not just getting these colors that a designer picks out in Photoshop. And a big thing here is testing on different devices. I mean, we all do this already, but they're all sitting on a desk in our office, all the different phones and tablets. And we don't think of taking them outside and testing our site on all these devices in bright light, in sunlight, turning off the lights in the room, testing our websites in a dark room to see if they still work. And it's really important. And nobody's really doing this and talking about this, and we can do better to make sure that our sites are working not just on every device, but in all the different contexts that people are using the device, with bright light and low light, that's going to affect what they see on the screen. So we can't use media queries yet to find out how much light is in the room. But what we can do is change the color depending on the screen size to make sure those people outside with their phones are getting enough contrast. What you want to do first, really, I'm talking about screen size because we can't query light, but we can query screen size right now, and it's not 100% accurate. I mean, obviously, if you have a big screen, there's no guarantee you're sitting in your office, but with a big screen, you're probably not in sunlight. You're probably sitting inside where you can control the light level. So the issue really is the small screens that can be anywhere. They can be inside, outside, but the problem usually comes up when you're sitting in bright light. So you want to make sure that your site looks good and works okay in that bright light. And the key is having more brightness on the screen because you want to overtake the brightness of the sun. So it's better to have dark text on a light background than light text on a dark background. So that's something you might want to do. Let's say you have a design for widescreen and you have light text on a dark background, and it's really great design, it looks great. But for the small screen, to make sure it's going to still be easy to see outside, you might want to switch that around. Use the same color scheme, but use a media query for the smaller screens to have dark text and light background. You can also add more saturation to photos because photos are going to look washed out on the small screen. So probably something to think about for those small screens is use responsive images to switch out a different variation of the image that's more saturated, that's easier to see in that bright light. Another thing to think about is when you're doing a design for the small screen, you don't need as many colors. On a large screen, there's a lot going on. There's multiple columns. There's all these things on the page at the same time, so you have to make sure that it's easy to see. This is a sidebar. This is something different. On the small screen, you're only looking at a couple things at the same time, so there's not as much need for that visual differentiation between things. You don't necessarily need as many colors on the screen. And having the same amount of colors as your widescreen version might just clutter things up and make it, look kind of tacky. So that's something to think about too. There's actually not a lot of examples of using color responsively on websites. And when I started researching this topic, I really thought I'd find a lot more, because this is something that's really interesting and can really help users be able to use your website better when they're out in sunlight. And I have a couple examples here. Here's one website on a widescreen version. The navigation and text at the top is on top of the photograph. So there's kind of enough contrast to see here. It's not great, but if you had this same thing and you're out in bright light, it's going to be really hard to see that text at the top of the screen. So what they do on the small screen version of the design is they actually have a blue background for the text, so it really stands out and it's easy to see. But they weren't really thinking about bright light, because it's clear at the bottom, this part, the white text on the gray background, you're not going to be able to see that in bright light at all. So that's another thing on their site they should have looked at and said, is this still going to work if I'm out in bright light? Another example here, it's kind of similar. They have text over the top, and on the small screen version, they change it to white text on black background instead of having text overlaying a photo, which there really isn't enough contrast to see it well. And like I said, there's not enough examples of this, and I'm surprised more people aren't doing it. And it's something, as I've been researching it, I've been realizing this is something I need to do on websites that I make. Make sure I test them in the bright light and see if there's something I can do to make sure that the sites still work okay out in bright light or in dim light, or if I can add media queries to change what's on the small screen to make sure there's enough contrast for those users. Another thing to think about is printers, and we've kind of forgotten this, but a lot of people actually still print out websites when they need to refer to something later, or if they need notes for a meeting. This should be a device in your device lab. You should always be testing your websites on printers, because you don't know how it's going to turn out. I mean, the layout might be kind of funky, so you need to look at that. But also think about the color, because your site might be printing in black and white, or the colors might not look good when they're printed on a page, so you might want to add media queries to work with that. Print media queries, of course, are very simple, and we've been doing these for a long time. You can do a link to a print style sheet to add some different styles, or do a print media query just to add a few different styles to change the colors. So beyond how colors look on the screen, there's a lot of things we can do in CSS to make it easier to work with color. And the more that we're thinking about color, we want to make it easier too. So SAS is really great for color. It's a preprocessor, and you'll be hearing more about it today. But basically, it's shortcuts for writing CSS that are processed into CSS before sending to the browser. Color variables are one of the most basic things you can do in SAS, and one of the most handy. So for example, if you have a color green you use throughout your site a lot, here its green is 278232. You don't want to keep typing that number over and over, and you're never going to remember what it is. So you give it a variable, which always starts with a $sign. So this is $green. So then whenever you have that variable in your SAS, it's going to be processed into the actual color. So what you see on the top is the SAS, and what you see on the bottom is the CSS it's processed into. Just the color green is replaced by the number. So you can give it any name you want. Sometimes you might use actual names like green or light green, or primary background color. And there's actually a lot of theory into the different ways you can do this and how they'll work out. You are the most wonderful person ever. No. If I wasn't married, I'd marry you right now, I swear. Nobody tell my husband that, please. So there's different ways you can use variables that, you can read more on this, because there's ways to make it really easy to understand how your colors are being used. And also with the variables, if you need to change a color, you don't want to go change it in 84 different places. This way you can only change it once, and it'll make the correct color appear everywhere in your CSS. Then there's SAS functions you can use to change colors. For example, lighten and darken you can use to change the hue. Pretty simple to write out. Lighten is your function. In parentheses, you have your starting color, the percentage you want to lighten it. So here, the CSS at the top, you have a purple. Your box 1, the background color is purple. The box 2, the background color is lighten that purple by 20%. And then it processes out to the CSS you see on the bottom, which gets sent to the browser. So you just have a purple box and a lighter purple box. So you've only chosen one color, and then you've used a function to change that color. You can do the same thing with darken a purple by 40% and get that. A good way to use this, and this is just an example, but let's say you have some colors you want to use over and over again, but with different colors, like a button. Here I have a button with a starting color of B65069. I give the button a background color of that color, I give it a border, I darken that color, and then the box shadow, I lighten that color. So I get this, just a simple button with a darker border and a lighter background. But here's the cool part. Let's say I want a blue button, I only need to change the starting color. I don't need to rewrite all the code. Or a green button. So if you're having similar things on your website with similar colors, by using lighten and darken, you can just do the formula for each one without having to figure out what all of the colors are. Here's a practical use. An example of something to make your color look better on a website. Here we have some text, and the headline and the text are the same color. But if you're looking at this, and you maybe can't see it as well on the screen, but if you're looking at it on a computer and a device, even though they're the same color, the headline is actually going to look darker because the strokes of the text are thicker on the large letters. So if you want this to look the exact same color, you actually need to make the text look slightly darker. And here's where you can use a function like darken to say that the paragraph text is going to be 20% darker than the headline text. So no matter what color you choose, the paragraph text will always darken to make sure it looks the same as the larger text above it. We can use saturate and desaturate to add more or less gray to color. So blue, to saturate it by 70%. It just takes this less saturated blue and adds more saturation. You can have less saturation. Grayscale, if you want to take a color and make it into grayscale. You can do the inverse of a color. There's a lot of different things you can do. You can determine from any individual color, pull out the red, green, and blue values, or the hue, saturation, and luminosity. That's something that's handy to do if you're trying to make different color palettes and match the colors together. There's a whole bunch of other qualities you can do. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but if you're interested in doing more with colors on your website, SAS is something that'll make the job a lot easier. This is a cool website to show how SAS functions affect a color. It's called SAS.me. So you just pick a starting color, and then all you need to do is on the bottom, there's sliders where you can adjust the saturation and the darkness and lightness and the hue. And once you've made all the changes in the sliders, in the middle there, it tells you what the SAS is to make those colors happen. So it's kind of neat if you're trying to learn how darken and saturation and all these affect colors, you can use this to just kind of get an idea in your head of what's happening. Lastly, blend is something pretty cool that you can do with color in CSS. You can blend a background image with a color or another image using the background blend mode CSS property. You can also, this is how the code looks. You start with an image, in this case, background image, then you have a background color, which is purple. You're going to combine these, so the last thing, the background blend mode is multiply. There's a bunch of different options here I'll show you. What happens here, you start with a normal image, and you're going to multiply it with the color purple we chose. So all it does, it takes the two colors, the color of the background image on each pixel, and then the color purple on each pixel, and multiplies them together to get the resulting color that it displays for this pixel. So, this is nice if you want to just have all your, some decorative images just be saturated with different colors or look different. There's a lot of different things you can do. Something called screen, what this does, it inverts the colors, multiplies them, and inverts that value, which this is a little more complicated than I can understand, but the effect is similar to two images shown on a projection screen. So if you're not, if you don't have a design mode, you might not understand actually what all these do. These are the same terms that you've probably seen if you've looked in Photoshop, like overlay, darken, lighten, color dodge. So it's the same thing, but if you want to do this to an image, you can do it in CSS without having to go in Photoshop or without having to have multiple variations of an image. You can just have one and change the color as you need to. So that's just something pretty interesting you can do. You can also combine two images the same way. So background blend mode is supported in Firefox, Chrome, Opera, and Android. It's partially supported in Safari and iOS, which means some of those qualities I just showed you are supported and some aren't. Not supported in IE and Opera Mini. So, progressive enhancement, this is something neat you can do on your website that's going to show up for some users and not other users. As long as you're not using the color for meaning, that's fine. You can also use something called mixed blend mode, which combines a foreground element and a background element. Also, there's a blend mode in Canvas and in SVG that works slightly differently. So those are just a few cool things you can do with color, but returning back to Dorothy's red slippers and responsive color. We have the power to transform an experience with color in a movie, on a website, but on a website the colors aren't the experience. That's what we need to keep in mind. And making a website, your colors aren't going to look the same to everybody, but that doesn't matter. Responsive design isn't about making things look the same. It's about providing an optimal viewing experience across devices and not the same experience for everyone. So we already know layout isn't going to stay the same if we want a site to work on every device. The layout needs to change. The navigation needs to change. But we still want the exact colors we picked in Photoshop to look the same on every single device. And we need to just realize that's not going to happen. There's no physical way in the world to make that happen. That's not the fault of the devices, that's just the way that light works. So we're stuck with that. But we need to embrace that and think about that with color. I showed you some cool tools, but I also showed you, most importantly, that you need to be thinking about how color looks on every device. You need to test on different devices in different light to make sure that people are still getting something that looks good and works for them. So think about that as you're putting sites together, how you can use color to make things look better on different devices, to give everybody a better experience on their device, no matter what device they're using. And that's all. Thank you.
Step into my office. Clarissa also gave us, her publisher gave us 3 books to give out for the best questions. So.
And that's O'Reilly, so you can thank them.
Yeah. Very not colorful, but fair enough. The blend modes are coming to Microsoft Edge as well, and actually the code was written by Adobe for all the other browsers as well, so they've been reusing that from Photoshop, so it's a pretty interesting feature of it. A lot of this seems to me to be a basic accessibility as well, because as you said, relying on color in every accessibility guideline is don't rely on color. Mm-hmm. But we seem to do it a lot. Do you think testing tools, accessibility testing tools, and especially the foreground and background ratio, like saturation ratio that is necessary to make things readable, is something that people should care much for, or is it something that is just a hardcore accessibility thing?
Well, we should always be thinking about accessibility. I mean, that's always important. Even, the thing with accessibility, it's so easy to go, well, there's not that many blind people, there's not that many colorblind people, but those users still matter. They're still people who use our sites, so we need to do everything we can to make sure they can access the site. And you mentioned something I didn't bring up, which is the contrast ratio between text and the background color. If those are too close in color, it's going to be hard to read the text. So there's a lot of tools online where you can just pop in your 2 colors and it'll say if there's enough contrast between them. And that's not just for low vision users, that's for all users that are going to have trouble seeing text if it's not enough contrast. And especially older users that might not have very good eyesight. So we need to be thinking about all these people and what we can do to make the site accessible. Because if we're, selling a service or selling products, if we're making the site difficult for people to use, we're losing our users and our customers.
Is there any way to target black and white print specifically? Is there a media black-white print or something?
White print?
Black and white print.
Black and white print?
Yeah.
I don't understand what you're asking.
Yeah, okay. Yes, there is. Good. Also, the question with the battery power, I can answer that later, so that's not for her. How do we deal with the problem that corporate design forces us to use colors that do not work well on small screens?
Well, I mean, if you have colors that don't look good on small screens, you need to do something about that, because I mean, this has always been a problem in responsive design, is we have designers that are sitting with this big monitor in an office and making something that looks really great for them, but they're not thinking about the small screen. So bringing those into the process early and make sure our designers are looking at their sites on small screens and different light levels, you know, and taking care of that problem early so you don't get to the end and go, wait, we have an accessibility problem because this doesn't work or look good on small screens.
I don't have enough questions here, guys. You're really not good at that. Is color experience differently between different cultures and continents?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that a little bit. Like they did a study in Africa of a certain language that they use different words to describe colors. Like red and orange are actually the same color. And I think maybe what that question is asking is like how we think of colors. Like in Western colors, we might think of the color red as stop, but in Asian colors, I think it means something different. And I didn't really go into that at all, like what colors mean and what colors to choose, but that's something that, you know, they studied extensively. There's a lot of articles out there. So if you're trying to give a meaning to your site, like if you're trying to make it look, you know, soft or hard, or, you know, this is important, or things like that, yes, the colors might mean something to different cultures.
Yeah. One thing I found with RGBA as well, just a little bit of a trick, I found that there's no way in CSS just to go from a color to transparent and a gradient. But with RGBA, going from 1 to 0 with the same color, you can do that. In terms of performance, though, opacity is a lot of issues. So did you find that for small screens in a color environment, that opacity is something that should be dealt with light fingers rather than just used everywhere?
That's not really something I've explored, but I mean, again, you'd find out through testing if you have a problem with that and if you need to adjust it.
So it's the examples that you showed seem to me just by accident having different color headers.
Kind of, you know, and like I said, when I started putting together this presentation, I'm sure there's lots of stuff out there where people are using responsive design to display better colors on different screens, but nobody's doing it. And I think this is a problem that I found that we need to be thinking about, because it's really an opportunity to make our sites better using responsive design, and this just isn't something as an industry we've been exploring yet, you know, and I would like to be able to have more examples out there to look at. So hopefully everybody's going to go home and make their websites have different colors on small screens so they look better, so I can put those in my next presentation.
Well, maybe offering a SAS module that does it automatically, or like at least a preset, a set of presets would help to put that on GitHub so people can start from that.
It might, but I think in most cases it's going to really depend on what colors you're starting with, as to, you know, you don't want it to be too automatic because you're going to end up with colors that might not look good.
That was one of the questions. Shouldn't the devices do that automatically?
Adjust for the light level?
Yeah.
Well, they do. I mean, that's kind of what the brightness on your screen does. When you're out in bright light, the brightness will turn up, and when you're dim light, the brightness will turn down. But that's not everything. There's still a lot we can do in the websites too to help with that.
Yeah. What you said is like have a different color, have a different font set, image for light setting and these kind of things. I probably think a CSS filter, as you showed, might be the easier option to do that, rather than just having 2 different images to load.
It depends on the image.
Yeah. How about a media query that enables the browser to set a colorblindness setting?
You mean like the user would have to indicate that they're colorblind?
Yes.
I mean, how would they know? I guess they would. Unless
the setting is in green and red.
Give it another 20 years, and Apple will be able to look into your head and see if you're colorblind and automatically adjust something. But that I don't think that's
Google knows already, probably.
I'm sure they do. But we don't want to make. The thing is with accessibility is you don't want to make the users have to do extra work to make the site accessible. So you should just make it accessible for everybody to start and not count on them to say, hey, I need something different.
And in some countries, it's actually illegal to people ask about their disabilities. So that's another thing as well. When will the media query for light be available in CSS?
Later.
Later.
I don't know the answer to that.
The JavaScript API is now in Firefox, but is actually ratified right now by the by the W3C, so it's coming in Edge and other browsers soon as well. Chrome looked into it as well, and once we have that, you can at least write a polyfill with JavaScript to give you different classes on the body. That's something I might do when I get back to the hotel. because it is really easy to do. It's a wonderful API because the thing is always on. The camera doesn't have to be on to give you the light level. So if you want to have random numbers between 0 and 20,000, just read out that thing. I used it for creating encryption algorithms before. It's wonderful. I might have geeked out a bit there. Do you know David Walsh's approaches to color naming in SAS-less?
I think that's something I've read about. That's there's different approaches to color naming, but there's some that I looked at. It's like that are really interesting and seem really powerful as to the way it uses colors. But that's more detail than I could get into in this presentation, obviously. But you know, if you're starting to use color variables, there's different ways to do that. So you want to explore the different options.
Yeah, and I think that's all we got time for. So.
Did
we
you
will
find
have
3 people,
we will
or?
have you pick the best question and then get the people to have it here because I changed some of them around. I guess it's kind of tricky. Anyways, we do it after lunch, I guess.
Okay, great.
So.